Chapter 20. Independent Atom. On the warm summer morning of August the 24th, 1991, thousands of people gathered around the Ukrainian Parliament building in downtown Kyiv. It was a Saturday, and many Kyivans who would otherwise have been at work were demonstrating. There were also out-of-towners from almost every part of Ukraine. They carried posters that read, "Down with the CPSU," "Ukraine is leaving the USSR," and "No to the Fascist Union." A few days earlier, on August the 19th, hardliners in Moscow, led by the KGB chief Vladimir Kriuchkov, had ousted Mikhail Gorbachev and created an emergency committee that sought to reverse the Soviet president's democratic reforms. The plotters isolated Gorbachev at his summer mansion in the Crimea, but failed to arrest his political rival, the charismatic president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, who mobilized Muscovites in defense of democratic freedoms. The military refused to suppress the mass revolt, and by the evening of August the 22nd, the coup had all but evaporated. The triumphant Yeltsin brought Gorbachev back to Moscow, but refused to yield to him the powers he had acquired during the coup. He forced Gorbachev, who was still in shock, to dismiss his security ministers and accept those whom Yeltsin recommended. The Russian president also banned the activities of Gorbachev's last bastion of power, the Communist Party. Yeltsin's counter-coup made him the most powerful figure in Moscow. The Ukrainian party elite became worried, and the leaders of the opposition forces in the Republic were concerned about the possibility of a repeated coup by the hardliners. Neither group relished the notion of remaining under Moscow's control. As in the case of the Chernobyl disaster, the rulers and the opposition found a common enemy in Moscow, but they could not agree on whether they should move toward autonomy or independence. If they became autonomous, they would have some control over their local affairs, but still remain part of the Soviet system. Independence would mean a complete break from the Soviet Union. Rukh supporters demanded independence, while the party elite vacillated. The Kyivans, Rukh activists, and other supporters of democratic reform who gathered outside the Ukrainian parliament on the morning of August the 24th, demanded that the communist majority in parliament declare complete independence from Moscow. They were growing increasingly restless and calling for punishment of the Ukrainian communist elite, which had temporized during the coup instead of supporting Yeltsin. As tension grew outside the parliament building, Leonid Kravchuk, the Speaker of Parliament, who was under direct attack for his passivity during the coup, called on the 49-year-old writer and Rukh activist Volodymyr Yavoritsky, the head of the Parliamentary Commission on the Consequences of the Chernobyl disaster, to speak. Earlier in the day, the leaders of the People's Council, the democratic opposition in the communist-controlled parliament, had given Kravchuk a number of draft bills on which they wanted the parliament to vote. Among them was a declaration of Ukrainian independence drafted by Levko Lukyanenko, a dissident who had spent 25 years in the Gulag and internal exile. The communist deputies claimed that they had not seen the draft and refused to discuss it. Yavoritsky decided to use the opportunity presented to him by Kravchuk to read the text. He began with a call for unity. "Honored deputies, honored guests, our dear Ukrainian people, let us say that this is not a moment of revenge, but a moment of truth. Let us say that those who have gathered here are not victors and vanquished, but that in fact we have all been vanquished. This is our chance to leave those disputes behind." He then read the draft declaration with its key statement: "The Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic solemnly declares the independence of Ukraine and the creation of an independent Ukrainian state." Ukraine. This came as a severe shock to many members of the communist majority. Nevertheless, they did not rebel or protest, but requested a break for consultations. When they returned to the chamber, they were prepared to support Yavoritsky's proposal. Kravchuk put the question of independence to a vote. The result was stunning. 346 deputies voted in favor, with only 2 opposed and 5 absentees. Subject to a referendum scheduled for December 1st, 1991, Ukraine, the second largest Soviet republic after Russia and the home of the Chernobyl nuclear plant, would become a sovereign country. Levko Lukyanenko, the author of the declaration, later claimed that the honor of being the first to read it out in Parliament went to Yavorivsky because Kravchuk, who wanted an affirmative vote, believed that Yavorivsky, who had been a member of the Communist Party until 1990, had a better chance of convincing the Communist majority. Lukyanenko is a nationalist, twice sentenced, and a recidivist, said Lukyanenko, recalling the reasoning conveyed to him by those close to Kravchuk. Communists hunted nationalists and imprisoned them. They look upon the nationalist Lukyanenko as an enemy, while Yavorivsky is close to the majority. If Lukyanenko reads the act, then many communists may not vote for it, but they would see Yavorivsky as one of their own, and a constitutional majority would be attained more quickly. Kravchuk later denied that he had chosen Yavorivsky over Lukyanenko for political reasons. One way or the other, it was Yavorivsky who got to the microphone first. The writer-turned-activist Volodymyr Yavorivsky first emerged on the Ukrainian political scene in the fall of 1989 as the principal organizer of the First Congress of Ruch. In the spring of 1990, he ran for election to the Ukrainian parliament, condemning the damage done to Ukraine by the Chernobyl disaster. Yavorivsky was an unlikely champion of the anti-nuclear cause. An early proponent of nuclear power in Ukraine, he had published a novel, Chain Reaction, 1978, that celebrated the construction of the Chernobyl power plant as a triumph of communist modernity and a sign of Ukrainian entry into the modern age. He dismissed concerns about the safety of nuclear reactors as an overreaction to the American bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, maintaining that only in the capitalist world were there legitimate grounds for such concerns. Like a number of Ukrainian writers, including the leader of Ruch, Ivan Drach, Yavorivsky began his evolution from nuclear enthusiast to anti-nuclear crusader soon after the catastrophe. In the novel Maria with Wormwood at the End of the Century, 1987, which Yavorivsky wrote after spending more than 2 months of symbolic repentance in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, he showed a growing preoccupation with the idea of personal responsibility for one's actions. More concretely, as Yavorivsky saw it, the individual was responsible to the family, to the homeland, and ultimately to the nation. Oles Honchar, Ukraine's best-known writer at the time, wrote to Yavorivsky upon the publication of his book, "Through your words, Ukraine itself addressed the world from the Chernobyl era with its pains and its hopes." Once in Parliament, Yavorivsky focused on the Chernobyl issue and became chairman of its Chernobyl Commission, which was created at his initiative. The commission investigated the role of the Ukrainian party and government elite in hiding the truth about the scope of the disaster and the harm it had done to the population. The KGB, which had been involved in the cover-up, now found itself reporting to Chairman Yavorivsky on the problems that continued to beset the damaged reactor and the territories contaminated by the explosion. Among Yavorivsky's early targets was the former director of the Chernobyl plant, Viktor Brukhanov. A fiery speaker and writer whom his opponents accused of populism, Yavorivsky often made controversial statements in his written and oral interventions. He claimed, for example, that on the night of the explosion, Brukhanov had been relaxing with his lover in a forest lodge, and then neglected his duties as director, withholding information about the scope of the accident from his superiors and the public at large. Brukhanov, released from imprisonment in September 1991 after serving half of his 10-year sentence, was outraged. He recalled later, "Yavorivsky created an image for himself with the hasty publication of a book. He wrote all kinds of inventions. Since then, I cannot abide the name Yavorivsky." Brukhanov served most of his term in a prison facility in eastern Ukraine. He was a local celebrity in prison. When he arrived, inmates left their quarters to take a look at the individual charged with responsibility for the world's worst technological catastrophe. The prison authorities offered him a managerial position, but he refused to take it and worked as a mechanic. They would later transfer him to a halfway house in central Ukraine. It was only after his release that Brukhanov first met his granddaughter, who was already 5 years old. She was born soon after the Chernobyl disaster. Scarred by his imprisonment, he later claimed that about 95% of those whom I saw there could hardly be called human beings, Brukhanov was still in relatively good health. He went to work for the Chernobyl nuclear plant and then the national agency dealing with the nuclear industry. Many of his co-defendants were less lucky. The former chief engineer, Nikolai Fomin, never recovered psychologically from the shock of the disaster. In 1988, he was transferred from a regular prison to a psychiatric hospital and then released. His deputy, Anatoly Dyatlov, who had run the turbine test at Unit 4, managed quite well psychologically, never admitting his guilt, but suffered from acute radiation syndrome and was released from prison in 1990 on health grounds. By the late summer of 1991, when Ukraine declared its independence from the crumbling Soviet Union and Brukhanov was released on parole, few believed that Brukhanov, Fomin and Dyatlov were the main culprits responsible for the disaster. In November 1991, a commission of Soviet nuclear scientists, led by the new director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, Yevgeny Velikhov, concluded that the managers and operators of the Chernobyl plant were not entirely to blame for the accident. They accepted the conclusion drawn by a commission of the USSR State Committee for the Supervision of Safety in Industry and Nuclear Power, the Soviet nuclear industry watchdog, which declared as follows: "The flaws in the construction of the RBMK-1000 reactor, which was used in Unit 4 of the Chernobyl Atomic Energy Station, predetermined the grave, catastrophic consequences of the Chernobyl accident. The reason for the Chernobyl catastrophe is that the designers of the RBMK-1000 reactor chose a conception that turned out not to have taken sufficient account of problems of security." By the fall of 1991, Yavorivsky and his commission were going after bigger fish than Brukhanov in their search for those who were responsible, targeting the leadership of the Communist Party of Ukraine and the government. Volodymyr Sherchybitsky was dead, having succumbed to cancer in February 1990, but other principals were still around, including the former head of government and chair of the Chernobyl Commission of the Ukrainian Politburo, Oleksandr Lyashko. He stepped down as Prime Minister in July 1987, a year after the accident, in the month when Brukhanov and others were put on trial. Lyashko was proud of his role in dealing with the consequences of the accident. He had insisted on the evacuation of Pripyat before anyone else. Contrary to the position taken by the head of the government commission, Boris Yeltsin, and his own party boss, Volodymyr Sherchybitsky. Yavorivsky took a different view of Lyashko's role in the Chernobyl story. What actions were taken by the government and the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine when they learned of the accident? He asked Lyashko when the former premier responded to the commission's call and came to testify about his role and that of the government in dealing with the disaster. "It was at night, when I was at home," responded Lyashko, referring to the call he had received that night from the Soviet premier, Nikolai Ryzhkov. What actions could have been taken? Dissatisfied with the answer, Yavorivsky mocked the former premier. "Fine, so you slept soundly and then went off to work." Lyashko shared with the commission what he remembered about his efforts to mobilize city transport for the evacuation of the city of Pripyat and the activities of his government in the first days and weeks after the accident. The questioning lasted 2 hours. Lyashko and the commission parted on a friendly note. 2 members of the commission accompanied the 75-year-old Lyashko to his apartment building in downtown Kyiv. The former premier believed that for him at least, the investigation was over. He was in for a surprise. On December the 11th, 1991, 10 days after Ukrainians voted en masse in a national referendum to endorse their parliament's declaration of independence, And one day after Parliament ratified the agreement signed by Boris Yeltsin of Russia, Leonid Kravchuk of Ukraine, and Stanislav Shushkevich of Belarus to dissolve the Soviet Union and create the Commonwealth of Independent States, the Ukrainian parliamentarians gathered again to hear the report of Yavorivsky's commission on its investigation into the cover-up of the consequences of the Chernobyl disaster. The agreement signed by Yeltsin, Kravchuk and Shushkevich declared that the parties acknowledge the planetary nature of the Chernobyl disaster and commit themselves to join and coordinate their efforts to minimize and overcome its consequences. But for the time being, each country was dealing with the consequences of the disaster in its own fashion. That applied to the degree of media publicity given to Chernobyl-related economic, social, public health and ecological problems, programs for dealing with the effects of the disaster, and the level of political and legal responsibility now being assigned to the communist government leaders who were in power at the time of the accident. In Ukraine, the parliament went for harsh treatment of the former Soviet officials who had dealt with the Chernobyl catastrophe, much harsher than in any other post-Soviet republic affected by the accident. Ukrainian eco-nationalism was still strong, its mobilizing power seemingly undiminished. Eco-nationalism had earlier fueled the drive for Ukrainian independence, but it was now becoming a weapon in the struggle over the country's future between the rising National Democrats and the disoriented former communist apparatchiks who still controlled the government. Yavorivsky pulled no punches in his attack on the former communist government leaders for their real or alleged role in the Chernobyl cover-up. His ultimate targets were the Soviet imperial system of government, but for now he went after the Ukrainian post-communist elite, which was still clinging to power, as was no longer the case in Lithuania, the birthplace of eco-nationalism in the Soviet Union. Yavorivsky began his report by characterizing the Chernobyl accident as a Ukrainian national tragedy first and foremost. The biblical star of wormwood fell upon our earth and poisoned not only our grain, water and air, but also your blood and ours, he asserted, developing some of the themes first addressed in the works and pronouncements of Ukrainian writers, his own and others, published after Chernobyl. He went on to claim that in grisly fashion the catastrophe had made Ukrainians a chosen people. It is now clear that we are a people chosen by God, continued Yavorivsky. Perhaps our neighbors will not deny us at least that. Who was responsible for the national tragedy? Yavorivsky blamed the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and its branch in Ukraine. He called that branch Little Russian, using the name for Ukrainians in the Russian Empire of the Tsars, and thus employing a powerful trope of anti-colonial discourse. As far as Yavorivsky was concerned, communism, its empire, and militarism had come together to destroy the Ukrainian nation, which had been ruled as a colony. How was that accomplished? By placing a reactor with major design flaws 130 kilometers from Kyiv at the intersection of three Ukrainian rivers, the Dnieper, Pripyat, and Desna. Moving on to the issue of responsibility for the accident, Yavorivsky rejected the interpretation endorsed by Gorbachev, according to which the plant operators alone had been responsible. Contrary to his own earlier claims, Yavorivsky exonerated the managers and engineers who had been tried by the communist regime in the exclusion zone in 1987, treating them as victims rather than perpetrators. Instead, he lashed out against officials who hushed up the scope of the disaster, hid it from the people, and failed to take measures to protect the people from radiation, thereby committing a crime of huge proportions. Yavorivsky read out excerpts from the Commission's interviews with former Ukrainian officials, including Premier Alexander Lyashko, the former head of parliament, Valentina Shevchenko, and the former Minister of Health, Anatoly Romanenko. Romanenko's public silence on the health consequences of the disaster in late April and early May 1986 had made him one of the most hated officials in Ukraine. According to Yavorivsky, the commission had established that the Republican authorities had had access to information about radiation levels in Chernobyl and other areas from the first days after the accident, but that they had failed to inform the population about the dangers. He argued that even if the authorities did not understand the information they had been given and were unable to assess it correctly, that did not assuage their guilt. It only made them guiltier. And they are guilty, not only of utter incompetence as heads of a nuclear state, they are also guilty of not desiring, not wishing to know the truth, to say nothing of not wanting to tell the people about it, declared Yavorivsky. For leaders of such rank, this is a crime that verges on genocide of their own people. Yavorivsky charged not only former but also current leaders of the Ukrainian state and its officials, many of them present in parliament, with having committed a crime against the Ukrainian nation. Speaking after Yavorivsky's report, they fought back, defending their record and shifting responsibility to Moscow. The former Attorney General of Ukraine, Mikhail Gorbachev, who had been hospitalized with symptoms of radiation poisoning after spending the first post-accident weeks in the exclusion zone, claimed that he had done everything in his power to prosecute those responsible for the accident, but supreme authority at the time lay with the Attorney General of the USSR in Moscow. General Boris Yeltsin, the deputy commander of the Kyiv military district, who had been active in dealing with the consequences of the disaster, accused Yavorivsky of being too emotional in his assessments. A crime had indeed been committed, but it had had to do with the actions of certain individuals before the explosion, not after it. Ivan Plokhy, the new Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament, he had taken over from Vladimir Kriuchkov, who had been elected President of Ukraine a few days earlier, took the floor to calm the parliamentarians. "We were all raised in the belief that we would soon be heating our apartments with atomic boilers," said Plokhy, explaining the former leader's ignorance of the security risks posed by nuclear energy. "I am for the Commission continuing its work and finding out even more about the Chernobyl disaster, its causes and consequences," said Plokhy, "not just to deprive someone of his freedom, but to remind leaders of every rank about their extraordinary responsibility to their people." He concluded, "It has turned out that those who actually caused the disaster became judges of others. Therefore, in order to dot the I's and determine who is to blame and establish everyone's degree of responsibility, we have to ask who will judge." The chamber exploded in applause. Plokhy had in mind the guilty verdict delivered to Viktor Brukhanov, Nikolai Fomin, and Anatoly Dyatlov by Moscow-appointed judges in the summer of 1987. But it could also be taken as a rebuke to Yavorivsky. Who was he to judge Plokhy, who had gone to the disaster site immediately on April the 26th, organized the evacuation of Pripyat, and received twice the permitted level of radiation, 50 rem? Had not Yavorivsky himself welcomed the arrival of nuclear power in Ukraine in his literary works? Yavorivsky was clearly on the defensive when he returned to the podium. "Honored colleagues," he said, "we have prepared the resolution to be adopted by Parliament, and it seems to me that it is dispassionate. Let the procuracy investigate. We have given only a political evaluation." The person who found Yavorivsky's words most offensive was not in Parliament that day. The former Premier, Alexander Lyashko, learned of Yavorivsky's speech from the newspapers a few days later. On the day before the speech, Lyashko had buried his daughter, who had died of cancer, and he was in mourning when news of the speech reached him. Lyashko was particularly offended by Yavorivsky's claim that he had gone peacefully to sleep after Ryzhkov called him in the middle of the night on April the 26th, and that later in the day Lyashko had called the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to find out whether they knew anything about the accident, instead of calling his minister responsible for nuclear energy. Yavorivsky had indeed misquoted Lyashko's testimony to the Commission, in the course of which Lyashko had referred to the Ministry of the Interior, not the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But that was not the end of Lyashko's troubles. He was soon summoned to the Prosecutor General's office, which had opened a criminal investigation on the basis of the materials prepared by Yavorivsky's commission. Lyashko wrote a long letter to the Speaker of Parliament, Ivan Plyushch, claiming that he had had nothing to do with ordering the May Day demonstration in Kiev and had been in the dark with regard to the levels of radiation in the city. His wife, children, and grandchildren had also attended the parade. He blamed the Deputy Minister of Health for the lack of information and stressed his own leading role in organizing the evacuation of Pripyat, as well as the subsequent evacuation of pregnant women and children from Kiev. Lyashko asked the Speaker to put the question of responsibility for the Chernobyl disaster back on the parliamentary agenda and conduct hearings with his participation and that of other Ukrainian officials who had been in office at the time of the Chernobyl accident. Ivan Plyushch did not respond to Lyashko's letter, but met with him when the former Prime Minister threatened to make the letter available to every parliamentary deputy. "I know that Yavorivsky talked a lot of blather that deserves no attention, and the matter will come to nothing," Plyushch assured the former Prime Minister. He arranged for Lyashko to meet with the Deputy General Prosecutor of Ukraine, who also told him that the criminal case was pro forma and would not lead anywhere. The prosecutor went on to ask Lyashko for advice. Would it make sense to open a criminal case against the members of the All-Union Commission headed by Boris Yeltsin? Lyashko was skeptical. The Commission had made its decisions on the basis of information available at the time. Besides, the Soviet Union was no longer in existence. The USSR Prosecutor's Office had rendered its conclusions years earlier, and the court had sentenced those responsible for the accident. Lyashko expected that the Russian Prosecutor's Office would not prove helpful in reopening the case. The Ukrainian Prosecutor's Office followed Lyashko's advice and never opened a case against the all-Union officials. It did, however, proceed to charge Lyashko and other former Ukrainian leaders, including the deceased Volodymyr Sherbitsky and the former Speaker of Parliament, Valentina Shevchenko, with misuse of power and official position, entailing grave consequences. Lyashko refused to admit guilt and soon learned that the case had been closed because of the statute of limitations. The criminal case initiated against Lyashko and other former leaders on February 11, 1992, was closed on April 24, 1993, almost 7 years to the day after the accident. The 5-year limit on the prosecution of government officials for dereliction of duty had expired on April 26, 1991, even before the prosecutor's office opened the case, which amounted to a mere public relations gesture to pacify the parliamentary opposition and the concerned Ukrainian public. The attempts of the Ruch activists and eco-nationalists, represented by Yavorivsky, to not only condemn but also prosecute the Soviet-era Ukrainian leaders for complicity in the Chernobyl cover-up had failed. But they did succeed in making the government of independent Ukraine tell the truth about the impact of the disaster on the Republic's territory and population. Ukraine had embraced the public debate over the causes and consequences of the Chernobyl disaster as a tool of state and nation building, a means of mobilizing opposition to the former imperial center, promoting social solidarity, and establishing the legitimacy of the new state in the eyes of its citizens and the world at large. As a result of public pressure and the activity of Yavorivsky's commission, Ukraine adopted the most liberal post-Chernobyl social welfare laws of any former Soviet republic. It recognized almost 90,000 of its citizens as Chernobyl invalids, of the most severely affected category, and thus most in need of social assistance. In Russia, that category included only 50,000 people, and in Belarus, the republic that had suffered the most from the Chernobyl fallout, only 9,000 individuals were similarly categorized. Ukraine also recognized more than 500,000 individuals as liquidators, another social welfare category, as opposed to 200,000 in Russia and somewhat more than 100,000 in Belarus. Moreover, the Ukrainian legislators rejected the Soviet post-Chernobyl standard of 35 rem as the acceptable level of lifetime radiation exposure. Like legislators in Belarus and Russia, they adopted a threshold of 7 rem, the average that a citizen of the United States might absorb over a lifetime. The social and economic ramifications of those decisions were enormous. To deal with the new expenditures, the legislators had introduced a Chernobyl tax of 12% on corporate income. Ukraine began life as a sovereign state in the 1990s with high expectations, but a more than modest GDP of $1,300 per capita, which was crushed by the post-Soviet economic crisis and high inflation. The economy was contracting at a rate of between 10 and 23% per annum, and by 1994 GDP had fallen to slightly more than half of what it had been during the first year of independence. In the mid-1990s, 5% of the Ukrainian budget was allocated to fund projects dealing with the consequences of the Chernobyl accident, and 65% of social welfare resources were devoted to assisting the 3.3 million citizens categorized as victims or sufferers of the Chernobyl accident. For many, gaining the status of a sufferer whose health had been adversely affected by the Chernobyl disaster became a means of dealing with the enormous hardships presented by economic decline, rising unemployment, and the reduction of government funding for the numerous social welfare programs of Soviet times. If a person needs medicines, a person needs money. The diagnosis we write is money, commented a medical doctor attending to people who had been resettled from the contaminated areas. The Chernobyl social protection programs expanded the welfare system that had been inherited from the Soviet period, creating a major additional impediment to the economic recovery of newly independent Ukraine. While liberation from the empire helped to expose the truth about Chernobyl, the empire nevertheless left Ukraine with an enormous unpaid bill. It seemed at the time that the only way to start paying it off was to go back to the use of nuclear energy. That is indeed what happened in Ukraine soon after the declaration of independence. The same parliament of eco-nationalists that had passed a number of extremely liberal laws defining the status of Chernobyl disaster victims and created Yavorivsky's commission to investigate responsibility for the accident, was now ready to turn its back on ecological concerns and put economic objectives at the top of its agenda. It saw no other way of saving the people from starvation and the newly independent country from collapse. In February 1990, the Ukrainian parliament had voted to close the Chernobyl power plant by 1995. A fire in October 1991 at Unit 2, caused by a faulty switch in the turbine, destroyed part of the roof of the plant's turbine hall and made the task even more urgent. Parliament voted to close Unit 2 immediately, and Units 1 and 3, which were still operating, in 1993, 2 years ahead of schedule. But in the fall of 1993, a few months before the scheduled early closure, the very same parliamentarians reversed their earlier decision. They annulled the resolution of August 1990, which had imposed a 5-year moratorium on the construction of new nuclear power stations in Ukraine, and decreed that the Chernobyl nuclear power station would be closed only after the existing reactors there reached the limit of their operating life. Reactors 1 and 3 would remain in operation, and plans were made to restart Unit 2, the site of the 1991 fire. Eco-nationalism was now giving way to nuclear nationalism. The story of the Chernobyl disaster had taken another abrupt turn.